first time I heard Brainerd lead the Nathaniel Dett Chorale, I sat afterwards struggling for superlatives. I was raving about Brainerd's musicianship and vision, but it was Leslie Saunders who gave me the shorthand that I've used to tell new people about Brainerd ever since. She said quite simply, "The man's a genius." Founded in 1998, the Nathaniel Dett Chorale is Canada's first professional choral group dedicated to Afrocentric music of all genres, including jazz, gospel, spirituals, blues, classical compositions. It takes its name from the Drummondville-born composer, arranger, and conductor, R. Nathaniel Dett, who became a leading figure both in composition and as a teacher in the African American community of the early 1900s. The mission of the chorale, Brainerd's vision, is to draw attention to R. Nathaniel Dett, to lead the revival of his choral music, much of which is now out of print, and to perform the breadth of Afrocentric music. When I introduced Norman Otis Richmond last night, I said he was not only a pioneer but a prophet. In some senses, you need to be a prophet to be a pioneer. The same can be said of Blyden Taylor, with perhaps a deeper resonance on prophet, because Nathaniel Dett Chorale concerts are always deeply spiritual events. But I'm also convinced that Brainerd is a poet, as anyone who's heard him speak about the connections, let's say, on the theme of water between different spirituals and compositions that the chorale is performing would know. Without further ado, let me introduce Brainerd Blyden Taylor.
Good morning to you all. I am very appreciative of that kind introduction. It has been a wonderful journey so far. It has been a challenging journey to do the kinds of things that we have been doing over the last 5 years with the Nathaniel Dett Chorale. It's wonderful because in our beginning years, the music that we have been doing, it fits in very nicely with the theme that has been chosen for this particular talk. However, that theme is huge. Church and concert hall, black religious music in Canada. Where would one begin? I'm going to, I think, focus on on the parts of it that I have been doing so far with the Nathaniel Dett Chorale. But just to say at the onset that I'm conscious of the fact that this is a theme and a topic which, for my own sake and for my own interest in the things that I want to do with the chorale, I would love to spend even more time getting into this, because I think that it will, exploring this particular theme in terms of more intense research will provide the chorale with necessary repertoire to continue to do what we do. Trying to find out what is particularly Canadian, how it has become particularly Canadian, and differentiate that from what we consider American, or that's one of the things that I find challenging as well. And when we talk about Nathaniel Dett, he also spans both of these two countries, and the separating out of that is, to my mind at this point, not quite so easy. We have decided to repatriate this man, and I think that it's a good thing, because most Canadians are not familiar with Mr. Dett and with his contribution. So, before I sort of get into him, I would say that the things that I think would be interesting to explore would be the earliest forms of what we might call black singing, black congregational singing, and how that has grown up. It seems to me that just looking at the Underground Railroad and looking at some of the stuff that's been going on in Nova Scotia with the folks there. There's this overlap between the early spiritual, congregational singing that has come from field shouts, that has developed into sort of the song leader, which has developed into the gospel choir, which has developed into the more sort of celebrated concert classical stuff. And the Nathaniel Dett Chorale is trying to do various bits and pieces of that. We do not, at this point, have a show that does a lot of congregational singing or does a lot of gospel. We have done some gospel. And I'm proud to say that I was present at the founding of the Nova Scotia Mass Choir. And we have, I think, a roundtable is going to happen later on about gospel, featuring some of the more prominent players, I guess, in that aspect. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on Nathaniel Dett and tell you a bit about him and how he has influenced some of the religious music that I deem to be also Canadian, and how we have how that sort of overlaps both the church and the concert hall. Nathaniel Dett, I guess his roots go back to his maternal grandmother. She came through the Underground Railroad in the early 1850s. It is unclear whether she was a slave who escaped, or whether she had been actually freed and then made her way through the Underground Railroad to Canada. It seems as though she probably needed to be here for whatever reasons. And she was in the Washington area at the time and came through to what we now know is Niagara Falls, Ontario, but to a little community called Drummondville. If you look at the old ordnance maps of that area, in the mid-1800s, Governor Simcoe, after the declaration here, sort of abolishing slavery and making it possible for people to come to these parts, helped these communities to evolve, and Drummondville was one of those small towns, along with the township of Simcoe and others, to develop. His grandmother's name was Harriet Washington, and she, if we go back to the Dett collection and start looking at some of the things that he has now developed, she would be a very good example of some of the very early musics, the church musics that would have been done, the spiritual religious singing. He learnt a lot of this from her knee. And what I want to do as we go through this is to play you some examples of some of this and just show how this music has developed from very simple forms to much more complicated forms. There are two pieces, for instance, that we might listen to now. If we play a little bit of track number 4, but just before we do that, and then track number 5, we'll just jump. We'll just tell you to jump for a bit. Track number 4, what you're going to hear is a piece called "Hew Round the Tree," and it's a 2-tone melody. It's very, very simple, just based on 2 notes, ta 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 ta, and would have been an example of some of the simple congregational singing that would have happened in these early communities, and then we'll follow that with a piece called "Baptism," which is another piece that Nathaniel Dett heard his maternal grandmother sing. And he has developed it, he's added words to it. But that gets baptism moves on from here around the tree to show where we have moved from the sort of simple spiritual field shout to a more developed hymn in that regard. So maybe we can just listen to a little bit. We don't have to go all the way through. Track number 4 first. Okay, let's just stop it for a moment. Thanks. So there you see very much, and that's a somewhat more refined version of a lot of what would have been sung in the early churches back then, because there would be not only sort of like a field shout, but it's oftentimes there's that whole sort of circle, like a circle song, and again going back to the early African traditions, that's one of the things that's really survived through from Africa through the period of slavery, and is still often performed in several of the churches, and particularly when I go to Nova Scotia and hear some of the churches in the Buxton area, it's wonderful to hear some of this type of stuff going on still. But you would have had the person doing the call. You would have someone else keeping a very definite beat with a stick or something like that, and then you get into some of the clapping stuff that would go along with that, and then from there we progressed into like lining hymns and doing those kinds of things, and out of this has come the more hymn-like version and then the more gospel-type version. So let's listen to a little bit of baptism, that's number 5. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, from my own experience, that is very familiar to me, because I was born in the church and come from a long line of ministers as well. Both my paternal grandparents were educated in theology in the United States, and that's where they met, even though they were from the West Indies. So I'm used to hearing my mother sing very much like that, where that sort of again, what you heard there is a much more refined version of sort of the early moan, humming moan that would have developed then into words and into song, and moving back and forth between those two things. So those are examples of some of the earlier forms of religious music that would have been performed in these churches at that time. Nathaniel Dett took part or belonged to a black Methodist Episcopal congregation, which is considered, I think, the oldest continuously serving BME church. At this point in time, I don't know how active a congregation it is. At the time, in 1998, when I started the Nathaniel Dett Chorale, they were still meeting. It was a very small congregation. About 4 or 5 people were attending on Sunday mornings, and they had the person in charge was a circuit minister who would travel, among 3 or 4 churches to meet. And at this time, they were doing just a cappella singing in very much the same way. But Nathaniel Dett, in his early years, became the organist at the church there. There is now a small electronic organ, but standing in the chapel, there is actually a small pipe organ, which is quite amazing for that period. And one was never sure where it came from until Wilma Morrison, who is one of the people keeping the chapel going and this early work alive, opened a book one day and out floated a bill of sale for the organ, and it was a member of the congregation who had actually paid for the purchase of this organ, and it would have been the organ that Nathaniel Dett had played as a young child, as a teenager, in the congregation there. He went back and forth. When he was 11 years old, one of his older brothers was killed in an accident that happened. Several of the boys in the community were sort of carrying out a Halloween prank, and the local craftsman came out and shot at the boys and killed Arthur, who was slightly older than Nathaniel, Sam being the eldest. And so Charlotte Dett, Nathaniel Dett's mother, who was herself a musician and very well trained, very cultured and genteel woman, decided to move the family to the Niagara Falls, New York side of the border, just because of the destabilizing effect of this accident. However, kept a very strong relationship with Canada, and loving our education system, won the right for Nathaniel and his older brother Sam to continue to go to school here. So Nathaniel Dett graduated from Niagara Falls Collegiate Institute in 1901, continued to come back and forth across the border and play the organ for the BME church, for their Sunday school meetings, and developing this music and this love for this religious music that he had heard from at his mother's knee. When he graduated, he went to Oberlin to do his undergrad, and there begun to expand his this early music that he had heard. He was the first person of African heritage that we are aware of to successfully complete the double major in piano and composition from Oberlin. It was a 5-year program, and he did this with highest honors. While there, he continued his compositional career, and we have here, we can play you another cut. This is number 13. He wrote this piece and dedicated it to Dr. Whitfield Andrews, who he dedicated it to Dr. Whitfield Andrews, who was his friend and mentor, who actually took him under his wing and helped him to begin to hone this wonderful gift that he had. Nathaniel Dett was very much like Oscar Peterson in those regards. If any of you have ever seen the story of Oscar Peterson and his early beginnings as a pianist, he had this wonderful gift of improvisation and the ability to play by ear and to do anything. So he had begun to do this. When he went to Oberlin, he began to then find the wonderful richness that was Euroclassical forms, and begun to feel that he could do something more with the spiritual, and began to experiment with this. Go Not Far From Me, O God, he dedicated to Dr. Andrews, as I mentioned, and it actually takes two spirituals and puts them together in what we call a motet form or an anthem form. Okay, thank you. That's the opening motif, and a little later on, it combines the second part of the spiritual. What you see here now is taking these simple forms and beginning to sort of manipulate them into pieces that are much more classical in their orientation, and quite challenging vocally. I mean, the intervallic ranges require singers to have some real sense of their production and ability, but still very much focusing on the deep religious aspect that into which he was born and to which he was brought up. For a while, Nathaniel Dett really struggled with the idea of spirituals. This was something that he had this little crisis of conscience when he was at Oberlin, and there was a period there, not only in music but I think in literature too. James Weldon Johnson talks about this from a literary point of view, where in literature he was encouraging a lot of his colleagues to move away from vernacular, just because it seemed to poke fun at this period in time, and just the experience that folks of African heritage had gone through. And it's interesting reading about James Weldon Johnson and some of the writings that he had made before he wrote God's Trombones, which was a set of 7 poems. There were Negro sermons in verse form that he set and called God's Trombones. And James Weldon Johnson talks about his desire to write something in what he called noble language. It's interesting that we should have felt that at that point in time and felt the need to not be able to encompass the full gamut of our heritage. It is now interesting that we can go back and write in vernacular, write in dialect, and sing as well. So Nathaniel Dett was was sort of experiencing this. He had heard these things at his grandmother's knee, these religious songs, these things that expressed this full gamut of human emotion, but was not feeling comfortable at the time because many people, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and even the folks at Hampton, where he went to teach, several of them were still cautious about what the spiritual was and what this black religious music was, and felt much more that it was an internal thing. It was something that they did when they were by themselves, and not something that would be done in public. Because of the minstrel shows and because of a lot of those, the blackface stuff, and they wanted to stay away from that. However, it was when Nathaniel Dett went to Hampton University and literally met several people who had been recently slaves, who were now trying to educate themselves, and that he heard, he began to share this music with them. They would come to him and share this music with him, and it sort of took him back to his early days here in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and he began to develop the spiritual again, seeing in it this gold mine of source material that he could take anywhere. Dvorak is attributed as saying the same thing, or when he came to America and was involved with several of the people that were part of the Harlem Renaissance, Dvorak was noted as saying that the spiritual and these religious melodies were the folk music of North America and really were the gold mine from which so much else could spring. So it became something that Nathaniel Dett embraced, and he did a couple of things. He went back and tried to capture, as did James Weldon Johnson and his brother J. Rosamond Johnson, who did the anthology of the American Negro spiritual. Nathaniel Dett went back and collected and put into volumes some of these spirituals in their purest form, and then began to expand them for the volumes into larger forms. And then after he did the collection, he then even begun to experiment with even larger forms. So we have those small developed hymns, we have motets, we have anthems, and what we'll play for you next is probably one of his best known anthems. It's an 8-part anthem. He called it a religious characteristic. It's called "Listen to the Lambs," and is probably the one that is best known worldwide, has been recorded by several church choirs, both here and in America, as well as elsewhere in Europe. It is, where are we? Track number 6. Thank you. Sometimes when I hear this music, and I never tire of hearing it, and it works so well in both church services and has been received most heartily on the concert stage as well. It's so hard to remember that this music began as this simple outpouring of human emotion. If you go back to one of the earliest forms of that piece, you would hear people